You know what's funny about philosophy? We tend to remember the optimists, the ones who tell us we're fundamentally good, that virtue comes naturally, that humanity is basically on the right track. Those are the philosophers who get statues whose names become household words. And then there's Xunzi. This guy looked at human nature and said, yeah, we're a mess. We're selfish, we're envious, and left to our own devices, we'd tear civilization apart. Not exactly the kind of message that wins popularity contests. But here's the thing that makes Xunzi absolutely fascinating. He didn't stop at the diagnosis. He asked the harder question, if humans are naturally inclined toward chaos, how do we build a civilization anyway? That question, how do we create order when our very nature seems designed for disorder? That's what makes Xunzi one of the most important thinkers you've probably never heard of. He dared to challenge the most fundamental assumption of his entire philosophical tradition, and in doing so, he built a framework for understanding civilization itself that's still relevant 2,300 years later. We're going to explore a thinker who was controversial in his own time, marginalized for centuries afterward, and is only now being recognized as absolutely indispensable to understanding how human societies actually work. This is a philosopher who looked at the worst of human nature and said, okay, let's work with that. But before we dive into Xunzi's ideas, we need to understand the world that forged them. Because philosophy doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in response to real crises, real suffering, real questions about how to survive and thrive. Xunzi lived from roughly 310 to 220 BCE, right in the heart of what historians call the Warring States period, and that name isn't metaphorical. We're talking about 250 years of almost constant warfare across China, 7 major kingdoms locked in brutal competition, armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, entire populations displaced or slaughtered. The old Zhou dynasty had collapsed, and with it, the entire social order that had given Chinese civilization its structure for centuries. Imagine living in a world where the rules don't work anymore, where the old certainties about social hierarchy, about moral authority, about what makes a good person or a legitimate ruler, where all of that is up for grabs, where violence isn't the exception, it's the daily reality, where you can't assume that being virtuous will protect you, because the virtuous are dying right alongside everyone else. This wasn't just background noise for Xunzi. This chaos was the crucible that forged his entire philosophical project. When you're watching civilization collapse around you, when you're seeing what happens when social order breaks down, you don't have the luxury of abstract theorizing. You need answers, urgent answers, and Xunzi's central question emerged directly from this crisis. How do humans build order out of chaos? Not, how do we return to some golden age? Not, how do we wait for heaven to restore harmony? But how do we, flawed, selfish, violent humans, how do we deliberately construct a civilization that can survive our own worst impulses? This is what makes Xunzi's philosophy so powerful. He wasn't writing for a peaceful academy. He was writing for survival. He was trying to figure out how to save civilization itself. And his answer started with a claim so shocking, so contrary to everything his predecessors believed, that it would define his legacy and his controversy for millennia. But to understand just how shocking that claim was, we need to see who came before him. Alright, so Xunzi didn't emerge from nowhere. He inherited a tradition, a rich, sophisticated philosophical lineage that had already produced 2 of the most influential thinkers in Chinese history. And to understand what makes Xunzi so radical, we need to see what he was building on, and what he was about to tear down. First, there's Confucius himself, the founder. Born around 551 BCE, Confucius looked at the social chaos of his own time and said, we need to get back to ritual, to proper roles, to virtue. He emphasized ritual propriety, as the glue that holds society together. He talked about the rectification of names, making sure that rulers actually rule, that fathers actually father, that everyone knows their place and fulfills their role. For Confucius, civilization was about restoring an ancient moral order through education and proper conduct. Then comes Mencius, about a century after Confucius died. And Mencius takes the tradition in a profoundly optimistic direction. He argues that human nature is inherently good. You know that feeling when you see a child about to fall into a well and you instinctively reach out to save them? That's not learned, Mencius says. That's your natural moral sense expressing itself. We have these sprouts of virtue inside us, compassion, shame, respect, wisdom, and they just need the right conditions to grow. Education isn't about imposing order on chaos. It's about nurturing what's already there. This becomes the dominant interpretation of Confucianism, Mencius's optimism about human nature resonates. It feels good, it gives us hope. It suggests that being virtuous isn't fighting against our nature, it's fulfilling it. And then along comes Xunzi. Now here's what's crucial to understand. Xunzi isn't rejecting Confucianism. He's not some rebel trying to tear down the tradition. In fact, he sees himself as Confucianism's most rigorous defender. But he's also living in a world that's arguably even more chaotic than what Confucius or Mencius faced. And he's watching Confucian ideas compete with rival schools. The Taoists saying, abandon civilization and return to nature. The Mohists arguing for universal love and utilitarian calculation. And increasingly, the Legalists saying, forget about virtue, just use rewards and punishments to control people. Xunzi looks at all of this and does something remarkable. He synthesizes. He takes Confucian commitments to ritual and education, but he engages seriously with the critiques from these rival schools. He builds a more rigorous, more systematic, more philosophically sophisticated version of Confucianism. He's trying to save the tradition by making it intellectually bulletproof. But in doing so, he makes a move that puts him at odds with Mencius and eventually with the entire mainstream of Confucian thought. He looks at human nature and reaches a completely different conclusion. And this conclusion, this one claim, would make him the most controversial of the three great early Confucians. It would also make him, I'd argue, the most underappreciated. Because while Confucius gave us the framework and Mencius gave us the optimism, Xunzi gave us something else entirely. He gave us the hard truth about what civilization actually requires. So here it is. The claim that defines Xunzi's philosophy, the statement that would get him marginalized for centuries. Human nature is evil. Now let's be clear about what's happening here. In Mencius's Confucianism, which is becoming increasingly dominant, the whole system rests on the idea that we're naturally good, that virtue flows from our innate moral sense, that education is just about removing obstacles and letting our natural goodness flourish. It's beautiful. It's hopeful. It makes being moral feel natural and achievable. And Xunzi walks in and says, no, that's wrong, dangerously wrong. He looks at human nature and sees something completely different. He sees desire, raw, insatiable, selfish desire. We want things. We want more than we have. We envy what others possess. We're drawn to our own benefit at the expense of others. Left to our natural impulses, we don't build harmony. We build chaos. We compete, we fight, we take. This isn't some people, some of the time. This is human nature, all the time, unless something intervenes. Think about what Xunzi is seeing around him. The Warring States period isn't an aberration. It's what happens when you let human nature run its course. When rulers follow their desire for power, when generals follow their ambition, when everyone pursues their own interest without constraint, you get exactly what he's witnessing. Endless warfare, social collapse, suffering on a massive scale. But here's what's crucial. And this is where people consistently misunderstand Xunzi. When he says human nature is evil, he's not being pessimistic. He's not saying we're doomed. He's not counseling despair. He's making a diagnosis. Think about it like a doctor. If a doctor tells you that you have a disease, that's not pessimism. That's the first step toward treatment. You can't cure what you won't acknowledge. And Xunzi is saying, we have a disease. Human nature in its raw state produces disorder and suffering. But unlike Mencius, who thinks we just need to water the seeds of goodness already inside us, Xunzi is saying, no, we need to transform ourselves fundamentally, deliberately, through sustained effort. And this is actually more hopeful than Mencius in a weird way. Because if Mencius is right, and you don't feel naturally virtuous, if you struggle with selfish impulses, then what? You must be defective. Your moral sprouts must be damaged. But if Xunzi is right, then struggling with selfish impulses is completely normal. That's just human nature doing its thing. The question isn't whether you have those impulses, everyone does. The question is, what are you going to do about them? Xunzi is shifting the entire focus from what we naturally are to what we can deliberately become. From passive cultivation to active transformation. From hoping our nature is good to knowing it's flawed, and building civilization anyway. This isn't the philosophy of someone who's given up on humanity. This is the philosophy of someone who takes human potential seriously enough to demand that we do the hard work of actually changing ourselves. Not just polishing what's already there, but fundamentally reshaping our desires, our habits, our character. And that brings us to the question. If human nature is evil, If we're naturally inclined toward chaos and selfishness, then how do we transform ourselves? How do we build order out of disorder? Xunzi had a plan, and it was brilliant. Okay, so if we're naturally selfish and chaotic, what's the cure? How do we transform raw human nature into civilized human beings? Xunzi's answer comes in 3 parts, and they all work together as a system. This isn't just be good or try harder. This is sophisticated social technology for reshaping human nature itself. First, ritual, what the Chinese call li. Now, when we hear ritual in English, we tend to think of empty ceremonies, going through the motions, stuff that doesn't really matter. But that's not what Xunzi means at all. For him, ritual is the entire structure of proper social behavior. It's how you greet someone, how you show respect to your parents, how you conduct yourself at a funeral, how you participate in community celebrations, how you relate to authority, how you treat strangers. It's the choreography of civilization. And here's what's brilliant about it. Ritual works by channeling desire, not suppressing it. Think about it. You have natural desires for recognition, for belonging, for status, for pleasure. Those desires aren't going away, but ritual gives them a structured outlet. It teaches you to pursue recognition through proper behavior rather than through domination. It channels your desire for status into fulfilling social roles rather than trampling others. It transforms competition into ceremony. Ritual is like, imagine human desire as water. Left alone, water floods and destroys. But channel it properly. Build the irrigation systems, the aqueducts, the careful pathways, and that same water becomes the foundation of agriculture, of cities, of civilization itself. That's what ritual does with human desire. And it works through repetition. You practice bowing respectfully until it becomes second nature. You practice the proper way to serve tea until the movements feel natural. You internalize the social roles until you're not just performing them. You've become someone for whom these behaviors feel right. The ritual literally reshapes your character over time. But ritual alone isn't enough. Because ritual structures behavior, but it doesn't necessarily transform emotions. That's where the second element comes in, music. And I need you to understand, Xunzi isn't talking about music as entertainment. He's talking about music as emotional architecture. Music, he argues, has this unique power to shape what we feel. It harmonizes the emotions, creates shared feeling within a community, cultivates the inner states that make virtue possible. Think about how music works on you. A funeral dirge makes you feel solemnity and grief. A martial anthem stirs courage and solidarity. A celebration song generates joy and communal belonging. Music doesn't just express emotions. It creates them, shapes them, directs them. And when a whole community participates in the same musical traditions, they're literally synchronizing their emotional lives. So ritual structures your behavior, music shapes your emotions, and together they're working on you from the outside in. But, and this is crucial, none of this works without the third element, conscious effort. This is where Xunzi parts ways completely with any kind of passive approach to moral development. You don't just absorb virtue by being around good people. You don't just naturally grow into goodness like a plant in sunlight. You have to work, deliberately, constantly, over years. He calls this deliberate effort, conscious activity, artificial transformation. And yes, he uses the word artificial proudly. Because for Xunzi, everything valuable about human civilization is artificial. It's constructed. It's the result of sustained human effort working against our natural tendencies. Think about learning any difficult skill, playing an instrument, speaking a foreign language, mastering a martial art. At first, everything feels awkward and unnatural. You have to think about every movement, every word, every note. It's exhausting. Your natural inclinations fight against you. But you practice. You repeat. You correct your mistakes. And gradually, very gradually, what was artificial becomes second nature. What required conscious effort becomes fluid and natural. You've transformed yourself. That's what moral education is for Xunzi. It's not discovering who you already are. It's becoming someone new, someone better than your natural inclinations would ever make you. And here's what I find so powerful about this. Xunzi is giving us permission to struggle. If you find virtue difficult, if being good requires effort, if you constantly battle selfish impulses, that's not a sign you're failing. That's a sign you're human. The question is whether you're doing the work of transformation. Ritual gives you the structure. Music shapes your emotions. Conscious effort drives the whole process forward, and over time, years, decades, a lifetime, you can actually transform your character, not by suppressing your nature, but by deliberately reshaping it through these civilizing forces. But transformation isn't just personal. Xunzi has ideas about how entire societies should be structured to support this process. And that brings us to his political philosophy. So if individuals need ritual, music, and conscious effort to become virtuous, what do societies need? What makes for legitimate political authority in Xunzi's system? His answer is fascinating and deeply pragmatic. He tells rulers, emulate the sage kings. But here's the twist. He's not talking about mythical ancient rulers from some golden age that may or may not have existed. He's talking about recent historical figures, people whose achievements are documented, leaders who demonstrably built order, created prosperity, and established stable institutions. This is Xunzi being characteristically hard-headed. He's saying, don't base your political philosophy on legends. Look at what actually worked. Study the rulers who successfully transformed chaos into order and figure out what they did right. And what did they do right? They ruled through moral authority, not through force. This is where Xunzi's Confucianism really shows through. Yes, he thinks human nature is evil. Yes, he's more realistic than Mencius about human selfishness. But he still believes that legitimate rulership comes from moral power, what the tradition calls D. A true sage king doesn't need to threaten and coerce constantly. His virtue is so evident, his commitment to the people's welfare so genuine, that people willingly follow him. Think about it like this. Ritual and music transform individuals by giving them structure and shaping their emotions. A sage king does the same thing for an entire society. He establishes the rituals that create social order. He promotes the music that harmonizes the community. He models virtue so consistently that people internalize his example. He creates the conditions where moral transformation becomes possible on a massive scale. The ruler's job isn't to control people through punishment and reward. That's just managing behavior. The ruler's job is to educate people, to transform their character, to make them into the kind of citizens who don't need to be controlled, because they've internalized the values of civilization. But here's where we hit one of the great ironies of intellectual history, one of those moments that should make us all humble about how ideas actually spread and evolve. Xunzi had students. Two of them became particularly famous, Li Si and Han Feizi, and these two went on to become the architects of legalism, the political philosophy that says human nature is so bad that you can't transform it, you can only control it through strict laws, harsh punishments, and constant surveillance. Legalism powered the Qin dynasty, which unified China through brutal authoritarian methods. It's basically the opposite of everything Xunzi taught about moral transformation and virtuous rulership. How does this happen? How do you teach a philosophy based on education and moral cultivation, and your students conclude that only force and fear can create order? I think it reveals something important about Xunzi's philosophy and about philosophy in general. Xunzi starts from a dark diagnosis. Human nature is evil. He builds an optimistic solution. We can transform ourselves through ritual and education. But if you accept the diagnosis without fully embracing the solution, if you believe people are naturally bad but you're skeptical about transformation, then legalism starts to look pretty logical. If people can't really change, then you'd better control them. Li Si and Han Feizi took Xunzi's realism about human nature and divorced it from his faith in education and ritual. They kept the diagnosis but abandoned the cure. And the result was a political philosophy that Xunzi himself would have found horrifying. This should haunt us a little, because it shows how easily philosophical ideas can be twisted, how a teacher's most important insights can be misunderstood by their own students, how the same starting point can lead to radically different conclusions depending on what you emphasize. But there's another dimension to Xunzi's thought that makes his philosophy even more radical, even more modern than we've discussed so far. And it has to do with his understanding of heaven itself. Alright, now we need to talk about one of Xunzi's most radical breaks with traditional Chinese thought, his view of heaven, or Tian. In ancient China, heaven wasn't just the sky. It was a moral force, a cosmic authority that rewarded virtue and punished vice. When disasters struck, floods, droughts, famines, people interpreted them as heaven's judgment. When a dynasty fell, it was because they'd lost the mandate of heaven. The whole system assumed that there was this moral order built into the fabric of reality itself, and human affairs were connected to cosmic patterns. Even Confucius and Mencius, despite their focus on human virtue and social order, still operated within this framework. They believed heaven cared about human morality, that the universe itself was somehow on the side of goodness. Xunzi looks at this and says, "No, that's not how it works." Heaven, he argues, operates by constant, indifferent principles. The seasons change whether you're virtuous or wicked. The stars move in their courses regardless of human behavior. Floods come because of natural weather patterns, not because heaven is angry. Droughts happen because of atmospheric conditions, not because a ruler has lost moral authority. This is remarkable. This is proto-naturalism in the 3rd century BCE. Xunzi is essentially saying that nature is just nature. It follows its own laws, and those laws have nothing to do with human morality. Now think about how radical this is. If heaven doesn't care about virtue, if natural disasters aren't moral messages, if the cosmos isn't watching and judging us, then where does moral order come from? It comes from us. Only from us. This is what makes Xunzi's philosophy so demanding and so modern. We can't look to heaven for guidance. We can't wait for cosmic forces to restore harmony. We can't interpret natural events as signs about whether we're on the right path. We're on our own. The burden of creating and maintaining moral order falls entirely on human beings, and this connects back to everything we've discussed. If human nature is evil and heaven is indifferent, then civilization is this incredibly fragile achievement. It's not natural, it's not divinely ordained, it's not the inevitable unfolding of some cosmic plan. It's something humans have to build and maintain through constant effort, through ritual, through education, through conscious transformation of our nature. Think about what this means for how we understand disasters and suffering. In the traditional view, if your crops fail, you ask, what did we do wrong? How have we offended heaven? But in Xunzi's view, you ask, what agricultural techniques do we need to learn? How can we better manage water resources? What human knowledge and effort can prevent this in the future? It's a shift from moral interpretation to practical problem solving. From seeking heaven's favor to mastering the natural and social world through human reason and effort. And there's something both terrifying and empowering about this. Terrifying because we can't pass the buck. We can't blame cosmic forces or divine punishment. If society collapses, it's because we failed to maintain the rituals and institutions that create order. If people suffer, it's because we haven't done the work of building a just and stable civilization. But it's also empowering, because if the burden is on us, then the power is also with us. We're not helpless supplicants waiting for heaven to fix things. We're agents who can study, learn, build, transform. We can figure out how nature works and use that knowledge. We can design social institutions that channel human nature toward productive ends. We can educate each generation to be better than their natural impulses would make them. Xunzi is essentially saying, stop looking up for answers. Start looking at each other. Start looking at what actually works. Start taking responsibility for the world we're building. This is why I said earlier that Xunzi is remarkably modern. This separation of the natural realm from the moral realm, this insistence that humans must create meaning and order rather than discovering it in nature or receiving it from heaven, this anticipates debates that wouldn't fully emerge in Western philosophy for another 2,000 years. And all of these revolutionary ideas about human nature, about transformation, about heaven, about political authority, they survived. Against considerable odds, they survived in remarkably complete form, which brings us to the text itself. Here's something we need to appreciate. We have Xunzi's writings. We have them in surprisingly complete form. And in the ancient world, that's actually kind of miraculous. Think about how much philosophy has been lost to history. We have fragments of the pre-Socratics. We know Aristotle wrote dialogues, but they're gone. Entire schools of thought survive only as references in other people's critiques. The fact that we have a comprehensive collection of Xunzi's essays covering the full range of his philosophical system is a gift to intellectual history. The text we call the Xunzi contains 32 chapters, essays really, covering everything from metaphysics to politics, from ethics to education, from language theory to ritual practice. And what's striking is how systematic it all is. This isn't just a collection of random thoughts, it's a comprehensive philosophical system. Let's break down what survived. First, ethics and metaphysics. We get Xunzi's full account of human nature, not just the claim that it's evil, but the entire theory of how desire works, how virtue develops, what moral cultivation actually involves. We get his naturalistic view of heaven and his explanation of how humans fit into the natural order. This is the philosophical foundation for everything else. Second, political theory. Multiple chapters on rulership, on the role of ritual in statecraft, on how to structure society, on what makes authority legitimate. This is where Xunzi lays out his vision of how to organize entire civilizations around the project of moral transformation. It's sophisticated political philosophy that engages with rival schools, the Legalists, the Mohists, the Taoists, and systematically explains why the Confucian approach is superior. Third, and this is fascinating, philosophy of language. Xunzi has an entire essay called Rectifying Names. That's essentially an early theory of how language works, how categories shape our thinking, how names relate to reality. He's asking, how do we use language to create shared understanding? How do we prevent language from being manipulated to obscure truth? This is proto-philosophy of language, and it's remarkably sophisticated. And fourth, education. Multiple essays on learning, on teaching, on the relationship between teacher and student, on what it means to truly understand something versus just memorizing it. This is where Xunzi makes his most rigorous case for why education is the foundation of everything, both individual virtue and social order. What's remarkable is how these four domains interconnect. The metaphysics grounds the ethics informs the political theory depends on education, and the philosophy of language shows how we communicate and coordinate all of this. It's a complete system of thought. And because we have it in such complete form, we can see the full scope of Xunzi's genius. We're not trying to reconstruct his philosophy from fragments or second-hand reports. We can read his actual arguments, follow his reasoning, see how he responds to objections, appreciate the subtlety of his thinking. This is important because Xunzi is often reduced to that one claim, human nature is evil, and then dismissed or caricatured. But when you read the full text, you see that this is just the starting point for an incredibly rich and sophisticated philosophical system. You see a thinker who's engaging seriously with the hardest questions about human nature and civilization. You see arguments that are still relevant, still challenging, still worth grappling with. The Xunzi is one of those rare ancient texts that rewards careful study. Every time you read it, you find new layers, new connections, new insights. It's philosophy at its best, rigorous, systematic, practical, and profound. But here's the tragedy. For centuries, hardly anyone was reading it. Despite the text surviving, despite its philosophical depth, Xunzi was largely forgotten. And understanding why tells us something important about how philosophical traditions evolve and sometimes betray their own best thinkers. So we have this complete, sophisticated philosophical system. We have a thinker who rigorously defended Confucianism, who built a comprehensive theory of human nature and civilization, who tackled the hardest questions about how to create order from chaos. And what happens? He gets marginalized, forgotten, treated as the embarrassing uncle of the Confucian family that nobody wants to talk about at reunions. This starts happening seriously during the Tang dynasty. We're talking 7th to 10th centuries CE, so about 800 to 1000 years after Xunzi died. And the reason is fascinating because it tells us something about how philosophical traditions police themselves, how they decide which ideas are acceptable and which are dangerous. Here's what happened. Mencius 1. Remember, Mencius said human nature is good. We have innate moral sprouts that just need cultivation. Virtue comes naturally if we remove the obstacles. It's optimistic, it's hopeful, it feels good. And over the centuries, this becomes the orthodox Confucian position. Neo-Confucian scholars in particular, the ones who are synthesizing Confucianism with Buddhist and Taoist ideas, they embrace Mencius wholeheartedly. And then they look at Xunzi and think, this guy is a problem, because if human nature is evil, if there's no innate moral goodness, then what are we cultivating? If virtue requires this constant artificial effort to work against our nature, doesn't that undermine the whole Confucian project? Doesn't it make morality feel forced and unnatural? Plus, and this really bothered people, Xunzi's students became legalists. Li Si and Han Feizi, remember, the architects of authoritarian state control. And people started thinking, well, if Xunzi's philosophy leads to legalism, maybe there's something wrong with his philosophy. Never mind that Xunzi himself would have been horrified by what his students did with his ideas. Guilt by association is powerful, so Xunzi gets pushed to the margins. Scholars still read him, you can't ignore him completely, but he's treated as the lesser Confucian, the one who got human nature wrong, the one whose pessimism led his students astray. Mencius becomes the standard interpretation. and Xunzi becomes the cautionary tale about what happens when you're too negative about human potential. And this continues for centuries, through the Song dynasty, through the Ming, through the Qing. Xunzi is acknowledged but not celebrated, studied but not embraced. He's in the canon, but he's the part of the canon that people are vaguely uncomfortable with. But then something remarkable happens in the 20th century. Western scholars start reading Xunzi, really reading him not just through the lens of mentioned orthodoxy. Chinese scholars, influenced by Western philosophical methods and freed from some of the Neo-Confucian assumptions, start re-examining him. And people begin to realize, wait, this guy is brilliant. His arguments are rigorous, his psychology is sophisticated, his political theory is nuanced, and maybe, just maybe, he was right about some things that Mencius got wrong. Because here's the thing, the 20th century gave us some pretty compelling evidence about human nature. 2 world wars, the Holocaust, Stalin's purges, Mao's Cultural Revolution, Pol Pot's killing fields, the Rwandan genocide. It became a lot harder to maintain that humans are naturally good and just need the right conditions to flourish. Xunzi's realism about human selfishness, his insistence that civilization requires constant effort and vigilance, his warning that social order is fragile and can collapse. Suddenly all of this felt less like pessimism and more like clear-eyed honesty. Modern psychology started backing him up too. Research on cognitive biases, on in-group/out-group dynamics, on how easily ordinary people can be led to do terrible things, all of this suggested that maybe Xunzi understood something fundamental about human nature that the optimists missed. And scholars started appreciating his philosophical sophistication. His naturalistic view of heaven looks remarkably modern. His theory of ritual as a technology for reshaping desire anticipates contemporary work in behavioral psychology and social engineering. His philosophy of language engages with questions that Western philosophy wouldn't seriously tackle until the 20th century. So we're living through this dramatic scholarly rehabilitation of Xunzi. Papers, books, conferences, translations, there's been an explosion of serious engagement with his thought. He's being recognized not as the embarrassing pessimist of the Confucian tradition, but as one of its most rigorous and relevant thinkers. And here's what I find beautiful about this. It shows that philosophical truth has a way of surviving even when it's suppressed or marginalized. For 1,000 years, the tradition said, Mencius is right, Xunzi is wrong. But the arguments don't go away. The text survives. And eventually, when conditions change, when new questions arise, when people are ready to hear it, the philosophy gets rediscovered. Xunzi waited patiently for 2,000 years. And now, finally, we're listening. So what can Xunzi teach us today? Why does his voice matter across 2,300 years and a completely different civilization? Let me give you 2 core insights that feel urgently relevant to our contemporary moment. First, the defense of learning. Xunzi makes the most rigorous case in early Confucianism, maybe in all of ancient philosophy, for education as the foundation of both individual virtue and social order, not education as job training, not education as credential collection, but education as the fundamental transformation of human character. And look around at our current debates about education. We're constantly asking, what's it for? Is it about economic productivity, social mobility, cultural literacy, critical thinking? And we can't seem to agree because we've lost sight of what Xunzi understood. Education is civilization's engine. When Xunzi says human nature is evil, he's not being defeatist. He's explaining why education matters so much. Because we're not naturally good, we need to be taught. We need to learn how to channel our desires productively. We need to internalize the rituals and values that make social cooperation possible. We need to transform ourselves from creatures of raw appetite into civilized human beings. And this isn't something that happens once. It's not like you go to school for 12 years and then you're done. It's a lifelong project. Every generation has to be educated. Every individual has to do the work of self-cultivation. The moment we stop teaching, stop learning, stop doing the hard work of moral transformation, that's when civilization starts to fray. Think about what happens when education fails. When people aren't taught to think critically, to control their impulses, to consider others' perspectives, to participate in shared social practices, you get exactly what Xunzi predicts. A descent into chaos, where everyone pursues their own immediate interests without regard for the common good. We're watching this happen in real time. The erosion of shared knowledge, the fragmentation of common understanding, the collapse of institutions that used to educate people into citizenship. Xunzi would recognize all of this, and he'd say, "I told you, education isn't optional. It's the only thing standing between civilization and chaos." Second, civilization as achievement, not given. This might be Xunzi's most important insight for our moment. We tend to take civilization for granted. We assume that social order, rule of law, peaceful cooperation, these are somehow natural or inevitable, that they'll just persist on their own. Xunzi says, no, absolutely not. Civilization is artificial, it's constructed, it's maintained through constant, deliberate effort, and it can collapse. Think about his metaphor of water and irrigation. Water doesn't naturally form neat channels in productive fields. Left alone, it floods and destroys. You have to build the infrastructure, the canals, the dikes, the systems, to make water serve human needs. And you have to maintain that infrastructure constantly, or it falls apart and the floods return. That's civilization. It's not natural. It's not self-sustaining. It requires ritual to structure behavior, education to transform character, institutions to coordinate action, and constant vigilance to prevent decay. And right now we're living through a moment where a lot of people seem to have forgotten this. There's this assumption that democracy will just persist, that norms of civility and cooperation will just continue, that the institutions that make modern life possible will just keep functioning. And when they start to fail, people are shocked. Xunzi wouldn't be shocked. He'd say, of course they're failing. You stopped doing the work. You stopped educating people into citizenship. You stopped maintaining the rituals that create social cohesion. You stopped taking seriously the project of moral transformation. What did you think would happen? This isn't pessimism, it's realism. And it comes with a challenge. If civilization is an achievement, if it requires constant effort, then we need to get back to work. We need to take education seriously again. We need to rebuild shared practices and institutions. We need to do the hard work of transforming ourselves and our communities. Because here's the thing that makes Xunzi ultimately hopeful, despite his dark diagnosis. Transformation is possible. We're not doomed by our nature. Yes, we're selfish and chaotic and driven by desire. But we can reshape ourselves. Through ritual, through education, through conscious effort over time, we can become better than our natural impulses would make us. We can build civilization out of chaos. We've done it before, we can do it again, but only if we're honest about what it requires. Only if we stop pretending that virtue comes naturally or that social order maintains itself. Only if we're willing to do the work. And that work starts with understanding, really understanding what we're up against. It starts with the kind of clear-eyed diagnosis that Xunzi gave us 2,300 years ago. Human nature is flawed. Civilization is fragile. Order requires effort. Once you accept that diagnosis, everything else follows. The need for education, the importance of ritual and shared practices, the responsibility we all have to participate in the project of maintaining and improving our civilization. This is why Xunzi matters. Not because he has all the answers, no philosopher does, but because he asks the right questions and refuses to accept easy answers. Because he demands that we take seriously both the darkness of human nature and the possibility of human transformation. Because he shows us that building a good society requires both realism about our flaws and commitment to doing better. In a world that's increasingly chaotic, increasingly fragmented, increasingly unsure of its own foundations, we need Xunzi's voice. We need his rigorous defense of education. We need his insistence that civilization is something we build, not something we inherit. We need his challenge to do the hard work of transformation. So the question isn't whether Xunzi was right about everything. The question is, are we ready to take seriously what he's telling us? Are we ready to do the work?